I was saying that we're about to establish a new tradition. We're going to start on time. And thank you all for being so prompt. I want to welcome you to this lecture, explain very briefly how it fits into the Hartman Institute's activities, introduce the speakers, and then get out of the way. My name is Bill Galston. I'm one of the participants in the Philosophers Conference, the annual conference, which has been taking place under the aegis of the Hartman Institute since the early 1980s, 1983 to be precise, and with a little time off for good behavior, this is now our 24th session. Our topic this year was expanding the perimeter of religious communities and more broadly exploring the relationship between members and non-members. Most of our conversations are internal, but the Philosophers Conference has a public face, which is the annual Robert Kogod lecture. We owe a debt of appreciation to many, many people. First and foremost, Bob Kogod and the Kogod family, which have done so much to help build this institution over the years, to the Hartmans, Daniil and David, for their leadership, and to the entire staff of the Hartman Institute for its support, hospitality, and hard work. Our lecture tonight, as I think you know, is entitled "The State of Israel, What It Means to Be Sovereign." To be sovereign. Our lecturer tonight is Michael Walzer, and that creates a huge difficulty for me as the moderator. He deserves an eloquent and extended introduction, but he needs no introduction at all. What am I supposed to do? Well, as is usual in such circumstances, an unsatisfactory compromise. Many of you know Michael Walzer as a political philosopher, as the author of such world-famous books as Just and Unjust Wars, Spheres of Justice. If I were to enumerate the list of major publications, it would take the rest of the evening, which would serve none of us. Many of you know him as well as a public intellectual, as one of the stalwarts and editors of Dissent magazine, as a defender of social democracy with an American face, and someone who is engaged in these questions with with global counterparts. Perhaps fewer of you know him as someone who has labored for the better part of 2 decades to compile and edit a landmark 4-volume anthology of Jewish political thought. The same sort of commitment that has led him to be, among other things, a member of the founding editorial board of the recently launched Jewish Review of Books. A few weeks ago, I had the privilege of attending a luncheon with Rabbi Jonathan Sacks, who many of you know is the chief rabbi of the United Kingdom, and afterwards I noted with interest that he had been asked by Sir Isaiah Berlin to give the eulogy at Berlin's funeral. And I remarked artlessly to Sacks, I never thought of Berlin as a traditionally pious Jew. No, Sacks replied, but he was a deeply loyal Jew, and that was the point. And loyalty, it seems to me, is a commitment to remain in a relationship with someone or something that's a special object of concern, for whose well-being and improvement one is willing to work with patience and persistence. Michael Walzer has discussed the idea of the committed critic as the heart of social and political life. It is a state of critical commitment in which the noun criticism never overrides, in the last analysis, the adjective committed. Indeed, to wax theological for a moment, one might think of the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob as the ultimate committed critic of the Jewish people. Whatever Michael Walzer chooses to say tonight, I'm confident that he will speak as a deeply loyal Jew and as a committed critic. And I'm confident of one other thing as well, namely that he is fortunate to have such notable commentators. And let me introduce them now to you in the order in which they will speak. To Michael's immediate left, but stage right, is David Lubin, who is the Frederick J. Haas Professor of Law and Philosophy at Georgetown University. His resume includes numerous publications and accolades in America and abroad. He's a noted expert in areas such as international human rights, just war theory, jurisprudence, and law and philosophy, among others, and he has recently completed a major source book on international criminal law. And then finally, to David's left is David Hartman, a man who in these circumstances quite literally needs no introduction, a founder, until recently the leader of the Hartman Institute, a man who has made landmark contributions to contemporary Jewish thought, especially but not only in the reinterpretation of Maimonides for our time, the author of such classics as A Living Covenant, A Heart of Many Rooms, and one of my personal favorites, I must confess, Israelis and the Jewish Tradition. Here briefly is how we'll proceed. Michael Walzer will offer us his lecture. Each of the commentators will then speak for about 10 minutes. Michael Walzer will then have a brief opportunity to respond as he chooses, if he chooses to do so. It's an offer, not a command. And then we will turn to the question and answer session involving all of you, which I will do my best to moderate. Michael?
Thank you, Bill. It's great to be here at the 24th of these philosophy conferences. I remember the first one. I get a little confused about distinguishing the 15th from the 16th, but it's great to be at the 24th. Given the way that Israel is embattled in the world today, this is probably an occasion when one ought to say good things about it. One ought to respond to efforts by European intellectuals and many others too to deny legitimacy to the Jewish state. And obviously there are good things to say and easy arguments to make in defense of Israel's legitimacy. In a world of failed states, tyrannical states, terrorist states, and morally bankrupt states that lend support to the tyrants and terrorists, Israel is a model of democratic commitment. Even those of us who strongly oppose its policies in the occupied territories can recognize the difference between this state and most of the others. But that's the lecture that I give if I'm invited at an American campus. Here, we can talk, I think, and have to talk differently, out of a Jewish tradition of anxiety and self-criticism, which is not the same as anger and self-hatred. And so I'm going to take this occasion to worry with you, or at least in front of you, about some features of Jewish history that have made statehood harder and more problematic than it might have been. These are Zionist worries, and they serve to explain why the project of negating the exile was and still is an absolutely necessary project. though I will also worry in a characteristically Jewish way that negation can sometimes be too successful, can sometimes be carried too far. So let me begin with a central issue of political life: the necessity, if you have a state, of ruling over others, over strangers, resident aliens, new immigrants, national and religious minorities. This isn't an issue only in imperial states like the old Soviet Union or the British Empire, but in all states, including the Jewish state. And it's an issue not only in Greater Israel, but in Little Israel, which is going to be my focus today. The United States rules over Indian tribes, the Norwegians rule over the Lapps, and now over Macedonians and Turks. The Italians rule over immigrant Albanians, the French over immigrant Algerians, the Egyptians over Copts, the Turks over Kurds, the Chinese over Muslim tribesmen, and so on. In the long centuries of the exile, in all of the diaspora, the Jews ruled only over themselves. We ruled only over ourselves, when we ruled at all. The autonomous or semi-autonomous communities, the Kehilot of Ashkenaz and of Spain and North Africa and the Ottoman Empire and Poland, Hungary and Russia, all of them were radically homogeneous. They consisted only of Jews. Good Jews and bad Jews, no doubt, but as Rashi said, bad Jews are still Jews. They do not become other. Even the Cherem did not create otherness in the Kahal, since its point was to force compliance with communal norms, to bring people back, not to exclude them permanently. So the Jews were responsible only for the well-being of the Jews, while our Gentile rulers were responsible for all the people they ruled, including the Jews. They were never reliably responsible. We all know the history. But we often turned to them for protection against populist preachers and murderous mobs in the Middle Ages, for example. And sometimes, at least, we were protected. In many of the exilic communities, we counted on the Gentile rulers to protect us even from our own criminals. They took charge of corporal and capital punishment. And we were not unhappy to surrender that ugly work. Jewish writers sometimes claimed that we were too good to exercise political power even for our own protection. You can find the 20th century philosophical version of this idea in Franz Rosenzweig and the religious version in Abraham Isaac Cook. We weren't brutal enough, and so we looked for protection to the people who were brutal enough. But I should remind you of Yehuda Halevi's comment on this question. In his Kuzari, the rabbi tells the Khazar king that the Jews have a closer relation to God than do the nations that flog and slay, whose power and might are great, whose walls are strong, and whose chariots are terrible. And the king responds, "This might be so if your humility were voluntary, but it is involuntary. And if you had power, you too would flog and slay." And the rabbi responds, "You have touched our weak spot." But what is most important for my argument today is that no one, no group of others, look to us, to our power and might for protection. Though Jews are enjoined in the Talmud to visit the Gentile sick and help the Gentile poor, that's for the sake of peace, not because we were in any political sense responsible for their sick or poor, nor did they ever count on our help or argue that they were entitled to it. Think of that as part of what it means to be stateless. We were never without communal institutions, but these were radically our own. They gave us some power to collect taxes, to organize welfare services, for example, but only for ourselves. States have a wider reach. This is obvious in the case of autocratic regimes, where the autocrat is responsible for all his subjects, not just for his relatives, though most autocratic rulers privilege their relatives. But even in democratic regimes where the citizens are collectively responsible for themselves, they are not responsible only for themselves. They have obligations with regard to everyone who lives within the borders of the state. In the United States, the Supreme Court has sometimes made itself the protector of powerless minorities among American citizens, and also, very importantly, of foreign residents, insisting that aliens have rights and monitoring how officials of the executive branch deal with them. Today, the issues that the court addresses arise everywhere. All states are radically pluralist, and all governments are responsible for some set of others. As I've suggested, Jews counted on responsible rulers, though we were more often in the position of begging for protection than of claiming it as our due. Thus, the ancient prayer for the king, adapted in some Orthodox congregations in the United States, possibly here in some different way, into a prayer for the president, which expresses the hope that he, the American president, will deal kindly with us. Will deal kindly with us. That's an odd thing to be asking of a president who has to ask us for our votes. But it is evidence of the exilic state of mind. And I want to stress again that in the years of the exile, no one ever asked us to deal kindly with them. Being responsible for the common good of a pluralist society, for the well-being of strangers, for all the others, takes getting used to. It's a feature of political life, not of personal or familial or communal life. We may contribute privately, personally, to charitable organizations, as I do to the American Jewish World Service, that help people whom we don't know in near or faraway places, but we aren't responsible for them. We hope that they do well. We hope that our contribution is of some use to them, but if not, not. And then we will say that there's nothing more that we can do. When we answer yes to the question, am I my brother's keeper, we usually have in mind a parochial notion of the brethren whom we have to keep. In politics, however, the people we have to keep are not only our brethren. Though the reach of the state is not universal, it extends well beyond family and ethnic kin. In late 1947, when the Jews of Palestine were about to enter the Society of States, David Ben-Gurion spoke to a meeting of Mapai, you remember Mapai, about the responsibilities that came with statehood. And this is what he said. We must think in terms of a state, in terms of independence, in terms of full responsibility for ourselves and for others. In our state, there will be non-Jews as well, and all of them will be equal citizens, equal in everything, without any exception. That is, the state will be their state as well. The attitude of the Jewish state to its Arab citizens will be an important factor, though not the only one, in building good neighborly relations with the Arab states. The striving for a Jewish-Arab alliance requires us to fulfill several obligations. This is Ben-Gurion's invocation of the ways of peace. But he then goes on, which we are obliged to do in any event. And these are the obligations he lists: full and real equality, de jure and de facto, of all the state's citizens, gradual equalization of the economic, social, and cultural standard of living of the Arab community with the Jewish community, recognition of the Arabic language as the language of the Arab citizens in the administration, courts of justice, and above all in schools, municipal autonomy in villages and cities, and so on. Now, Ben-Gurion was certainly too optimistic about the possibility of a Jewish-Arab alliance, and maybe more than a little presumptuous in including culture in his talk of equalization. Nor did he and the governments he later led live up to the commitments he described in that quotation, in that speech. Nonetheless, this was the language of a statesman, in the literal sense of the word, a man who understood what it would mean to have a state, to be instated in the world. And it was critically important for him to give this speech, precisely because the responsibilities of statehood were so new to the people he was addressing. Well, not entirely new. Here, perhaps Ben-Gurion's attachment to ancient Jewish history and his intense dislike for the exilic years, his own desire to negate the exile, served him well. I don't think it always did that, but in this case, perhaps it did. He remembered that David's kingdom, as it is described in the Bible, included not only non-Judahite tribes, but also non-Israelite nations. It was pluralist in the old imperial style, even if the imperium was very, very small. We have no information about how the other nations were treated, though some of their members seem to have served in David's army. Remember Uriah the Hittite, who did not fare well, and Ittai the Gittite, who did. Many centuries later, the Hasmoneans extended their rule over foreign nations, and we know that one of these, the Idumeans, the former Edomites, were forcibly converted to Judaism, but other groups apparently were left to their own devices, so that there was a substantial non-Jewish population in the land when the Romans conquered it. Exactly what political responsibility meant in those days is unclear, but in Tractate Avodah Zarah, the rabbis allow the Romans to claim that they have indeed taken responsibility for the well-being of the Jews. Asked by God what they could say for themselves, the Romans reply, "Master of the universe, we have established numerous forums, built numerous bathhouses, generated an abundance of silver and gold, and all this we did for the sake of Israel, so that they could occupy themselves with the Torah." The rabbis dispute this claim, providing a critical anti-imperialist account of Rome's supposed benefits. But even as they deny the Roman claim, they clearly understand what it means to act responsibly, or at least what it means for the Gentiles. They probably don't imagine that Jews can act in that way. They are already stateless, living in exile. Ben-Gurion realized that the Jews, even his Jews, the Zionist vanguard, the leaders of Mapai, had no experience ruling over others, and he also realized that this was something that has to be learned. There's no reason to think that it comes naturally. Domination may or may not come naturally. Responsibility for distant others, people who aren't part of the family, certainly doesn't. It's a political virtue, and we find it best understood, which doesn't mean best enacted, in long-established political elites. The old aristocracy cultivated a sense of service to the lower orders, even when they were actually exploiting the lower orders, but they knew what it meant to protect the others, and the claim that they in fact provided protection was their legitimizing ideology. Once the modern state was founded, aristocratic families sent many of their children into the higher civil service, and some of these civil servants really did serve the common good. After emancipation, some Jews entered the world of the aristocracy and the civil service, but only in very small numbers, and usually at a price. These were assimilated Jews, often converts to Christianity. They imitated their Gentile rulers. They did not produce a specifically Jewish awareness of what I will now call civic responsibility, which is what I think Ben-Gurion meant, or part of what he meant, or what he was trying to get at by the Hebrew word mamlachtiyut. The word is usually translated statism, but I think that civism gives us a better sense of Ben-Gurion's argument. Civism is precisely the acceptance of responsibility for the general welfare. Jean-Jacques Rousseau provides a good account of what that requires when he writes that citizens, when they are voting, should not ask only what's good for me or for my group, what's good for the middle class, for the steel workers, for old people, for the Jews, but also what's good for the country. They have an interest in the common good, which is also the good of people other than the ones they know. Now consider a true story about Israel today, or just a decade ago. In 1999, I was in Jerusalem, living in Jerusalem on sabbatical. And one day I read in Haaretz a fascinating story about the Minister of Labor, a Shas minister in Bibi Netanyahu's first government, who had brought suit against a restaurant in Eilat for violating the law about employing Jews on Shabbat. The restaurant was fined 200,000 shekels. It appealed, and the district court judge, this was the story in Haaretz, reduced the fine to 18 shekels and castigated the minister for what I will call a violation of the norm of mamlaktiyut. This minister had brought many suits of this kind, the judge said, but not a single suit aimed at enforcing the laws against child labor, or the factory safety laws, or the laws protecting foreign workers, or any other of the laws that one would have thought to be his special responsibility. Ministerial office for him was simply an occasion to advance the projects of his own religious group. He had no sense of being responsible for a state, of being responsible for the well-being of all the citizens of the state, and for non-citizens too, who lived and worked within the state's borders. I'm sure that he was a good Jew, but he was a Jew of the Galut, and of the pre-emancipation Galut, lost in what must have been for him, a totally unexpected state, a Jewish state with a substantial percentage of non-Jewish citizens. Who ever heard of such a thing? So we have to hear, we have to think about such things. And perhaps we also have to learn from the experience of other democratic states, which have, not without great and ongoing difficulty, accommodated the strangers in their midst. Now, there's another issue that comes with statehood, and that also requires learning from the others. And that is the need to argue about and to decide when to go to war and how to fight. The Jewish tradition is radically deficient here, and the deficiency again has a Zionist explanation. Adequate theoretical accounts of when to fight and how to fight are written by citizens of states that actually have to make decisions about those questions. And for almost 2,000 years, from the time of Bar Kokhba to the time of Ben Gurion, the Jews did not have states of that sort. We were often the victims in Gentile wars. We were not the agents of Jewish wars. Now, one might expect that victims would produce their own accounts of what should and shouldn't happen in wartime. And I suggest reading Maimonides' famous line about siege warfare, that cities should only be surrounded on 3 sides so that trapped civilians can get out. I suggest reading that line as an example of the victim's view of war. But victims more often produce dirges and laments, chronicles of death and destruction. They don't write moral treatises. The truth is that Jewish halakhic arguments about the morality of war are very thin. On the question of when to fight, the rabbis worked with the 2 ideas of commandment and permission. We have to fight when God commands us, as in the original conquest of the land, and we are permitted to fight, or better, a Jewish king is permitted to fight, as Maimonides writes, to extend the borders of Israel and to enhance his greatness and prestige. The immediate reference there is to David's wars, and there are rabbis in Israel today who think that both the command and the permission still apply, and some of these, I suspect, are chaplains in the IDF. Until fairly recently, this twofold classification was not extended to its natural third, prohibited wars. Prohibited wars. Chaim Hershenson, the wonderful, remarkable Chaim Hershenson, who sat in New Jersey in the 1920s, writing halakha for the Jewish state that he was sure was going to be created, developed an idea of prohibited wars, but it has not played a significant role in halakhic discussions until very, very recently. And one reason for this is obvious. According to the moral standards that have prevailed for centuries in both the Jewish and Christian worlds, the wars of extermination commanded in Deuteronomy would have to be prohibited. The rabbis couldn't do that. They had to find other ways of nullifying the commandments. But without that third category, commanded, permitted, prohibited, without that, there can't be an explicit and coherent debate about when it is and when it is not right to fight, or in different theoretical language, when war is just and when it is unjust. Before 1948, Jews as Jews in a Jewish state did not have to debate that question. For the same reason, we did not have to debate the many issues that arise in the course of battle. How should soldiers aim their weapons? Who is it right to kill or try to kill? And who must be shielded from combat? What risks must soldiers take in order to minimize the risks they impose on civilians? What degree of collateral damage is permissible? Jewish writers don't have much to say about these questions because until 1948, again, we didn't have soldiers fighting in a Jewish war who asked these questions and needed answers. As Rabbi David Bleich has written, I wouldn't trust myself to make such a strong assertion. There exists no discussion in classical rabbinic sources that takes cognizance of the likelihood of causing civilian casualties in the course of hostilities legitimately undertaken as posing a halachic or moral problem. Now, Rabbi Bleich writes a hard sentence. What he means is that collateral damage, unintended civilian death, whatever its extent, is not recognized as morally problematic by the classical Jewish authorities. That makes sense. Historically, it wasn't their moral problem, but now it is ours. And many of Israel's rabbis are still addressing it in the old way, as if civilian deaths, especially if the civilians are non-Jews, are not problematic in any way. Of course, secular Israelis are debating these issues in the languages of international law and just war theory. Just war theory is the creation of Catholic moral theologians who had a lot of states and a lot of armies in the field over many centuries. These just war and international law debates are very important, but they don't sufficiently engage the religious sector of Israeli society, whose members often regard arguments about just and unjust wars and even arguments about the purity of arms as non-Jewish or even anti-Jewish. The secularists, on the other hand, are not fully engaged, even critically engaged, with the halakha of war. They haven't, so to speak, naturalized international law and just war theory within the Jewish tradition. And many of them can't do that since they don't know the tradition. They have too successfully negated the galut. And so they can't argue in a useful way with their religious fellow citizens. And some process of that sort, of the naturalizing sort, will be necessary if Israeli Jews are to do two things that are critically important politically and morally: to learn from the wisdom of foreigners and to speak to one another. I want to finish this evening by addressing one more feature of statehood for which Jewish history provided no preparation, and that is the experience of formulating and arguing about foreign policy. In the centuries of exile, Stadlanut, was our foreign policy, the work of the Stadlan, the court Jew, the intermediary, who pleaded on our behalf for the protection of our Gentile overlords, asking them to deal kindly with us. The literature of Stadlanut is not attractive. It is a literature of humiliation. Reading it will make your skin crawl. It provides a very strong argument for Zionism and statehood. The men who pleaded for protection, Queen Esther is the only woman I know of in that role. The men who pleaded for protection acted in private. What they said was never the subject of public or democratic discussion. Mostly Jews didn't want to know what the pleading entailed. Everyone's assumption was that the Gentiles were always and everywhere hostile, and that's why it was necessary for some well-placed and wealthy person to beg, to grovel, to bribe. This was nothing like a relationship of respect and equality. But statehood, and then membership in the international Society of States, does bring us into a relationship of equality, of formal equality, despite the obvious differences in state power. Now we have to relate not to the exilic goyim, but to the biblical goyim, that is, to other nations that have the same standing that Israel has. It's natural, I suppose, to carry over to this new relationship the old state of mind. The whole world is on one side and we are on the other, wrote an Israeli rabbi in the 1970s. This is a widely accepted view, not only in the diaspora, where it might have some point in some places at some times, but also in contemporary Israel, where it is an astonishing misperception of the actual state of international politics. The sense of being persecuted, hated, isolated, and embattled is not a good foundation, psychological or strategic, for the diplomatic and military engagements that statehood makes possible and that statehood makes necessary. For the truth is that Israel is engaged very much like a normal state with friends and enemies. Right now, Israel has a lot of enemies, most of whom, thank heaven, are capable only of rhetorical hostility, a few of them dangerous. But it also has important friends whose value many of its citizens and some of its leaders seriously underestimate. Many years ago, I heard a very smart student of international politics say that we would know that Zionism had been a success when Israel became a full partner in the local politics of alliance and enmity. That happened in 1970, when the IDF defended Jordanian sovereignty against a Syrian threat. Ever since that time, Israel has been involved in Middle Eastern alliance politics. It is involved today, and it has strategic allies among its neighbors, even if these allies can't quite be called friends. But the all the world is against us mentality makes it unnecessarily hard to develop and improve upon these connections, unnecessarily hard to make prudential judgments about friends and enemies. Too many Israelis live in their still new state as if they were still in exile. Once again, I think that this is especially true among religious Jews, but the carryover of exilic attitudes affects secularists also. Israeli Jews need to deal with these issues: ruling over others, fighting wars and criticizing the wars and the fighting, forging alliances in the society of states. And what is necessary in each case, or what is necessary to get started, is a critical engagement with Jewish history and with the Jewish tradition. That is, with the legal and philosophical literature of the exile. The engagement has to be critical because exile makes for pathology. That's another Zionist argument. Though perhaps pathology is not quite the right word, it might be better to say simply that a history that did not include looking after the welfare of others, arguing about when and when not to fight, and dealing with friends as well as enemies, that's a deficient history and a bad preparation for independence and statehood. But there's also much that I haven't talked about this evening. The remarkable solidarity of the exile, its capacity for repeated regeneration, and the tough realism of its fearfulness. None of these are pathological. That's why it isn't criticism only, but also engagement that is necessary. Statehood was not the Great Awakening that Zionists sometimes describe because we weren't sleeping. In the years of the exile, we were busy surviving. Sovereignty is supposed to make survival easier, but there is a necessary educational process here, which is well begun in the state of Israel, but far from finished. Jews have to learn what it means to be sovereign and how sovereignty is best enacted in a world of states. Thank you.
I feel in an odd position because I am speaking between the talks of two of the great philosophers of our time, and apart from a slight change in order, I feel a little bit like the warm-up band at the concert of the Beatles and the Rolling Stones. There's only one moral requirement on the warm-up band, and that is to keep the set short. So just to recapitulate Michael's main point in slightly different terms, it's that in the exile, Jews led an existence that was in important respects non-political. It had no need of a policy toward treating non-Jews who were ruled by Jews. It had no need for a just war theory and no need of a foreign policy. To the extent, this is his warning, to the extent that modern Israelis ignore these issues, they are recapitulating the exile mentality, which they would do better to negate. A second point is that we would do well to figure out how to address these issues in terms of traditional Jewish thought. I want to give at least one gesture in that direction, but I am a secular philosopher, and I want to talk about this in more or less secular terms. To begin with, I'd like to add one feature to the description of the exile that Michael offered, one aspect of the exile that I think that we should not negate. Obviously, the apolitical or non-political character of Jewish life in the exile had terrible drawbacks, as Michael notes. It also had one important plus for the moral life of both of Jews and the larger world, precisely because Jewish communities were scattered around the world and felt solidarity with each other. Exiled Jews learned not to take national borders as moral boundary markers. Moral regard extended across borders, and in that sense, Jews became, at least in principle, hospitable to a cosmopolitan morality, by which I mean simply a morality that views the world as the relevant moral universe. Now, of course, during much of the exile, there was nothing cosmopolitan about Jewish regard across borders. It was regard for other Jews in other countries, in other Jewish communities. But in those places where Jews enjoyed emancipation, in those places where Jews rubbed shoulders with non-Jewish modernity, the cosmopolitanism became broader, and I think that, to use the tired phrase, it was no accident that Jews in Russia were hospitable to internationalist movements like socialism. It was no accident that American Jews were significantly internationalists, or that later American Jews are still internationalists and are among the major and most important contributors to human rights organizations. It was no accident that the architect of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights was a French Jew, René Cassin, who won the Nobel Prize for it in 1968, the Nobel Peace Prize. Now, obviously, it isn't easy to hew both to a kind of moral cosmopolitanism and to a form of nationalism, including Zionism, and that was clearly true for early Zionist socialists like Borokhov, who discovered that he really had to turn dialectical somersaults in order somehow to reconcile his Marxism and his Zionism, which I think he wasn't completely successful about. Now, I mentioned René Cassin deliberately because I think that the basic form that moral cosmopolitanism has taken since World War II is the commitment to universal human rights founded on respect for human dignity. This is the flip side of the emphasis on sovereignty. Pre-World War II, this is a kind of caricature chestnut about the evolution of the concept of sovereignty in politics. Pre-World War II sovereignty was absolute, but beginning with the Nuremberg trials, when the court held that the Nazis could be tried for crimes against humanity and war crimes, even if they were lawful under the domestic law of their own sovereign power, the idea is that the most basic human rights form limitations on sovereignty. But I think more important than that is the fact that basic human rights have become the moral vocabulary of the post-World War II world. Now, I don't think, as a philosopher, that it's possible to give a completely coherent theory of universal human rights, or at any rate, I haven't seen one that I think is satisfactory. I don't think that the law of international human rights is a coherent body of law. The concepts of human rights and human dignity are literally what I said. They are vocabulary in which conversations are discussed, and the advantages, I think the key points of this vocabulary are the idea that every human being matters, which I would translate as that all human beings are created in the image of God, that all people are created equal, that groups, states, exist for the people who live in them rather than the other way around, that there are some rights that are so basic that sovereign states can't infringe them, and somehow this is tied to a notion of human dignity. And in the past few years, there's been a vigorous debate about the limits of human rights in the United States, as there was in Israel, around the practice of torture. In Israel, the Supreme Court outlawed torture by pointing to the notion of human dignity. The rabbinical group that opposed torture most vehemently in the United States rested in part on the Talmud that human dignity is very important and supersedes a negative injunction of the Torah. Now, that may not be halachically pure to commandeer that maxim for this purpose, but it seems to me that this is the way in which human rights, human dignity become moral vocabulary. That is, that you take maxims that seem true in one context and apply them in novel contexts. And I think what I want to insist is that while I don't disagree with anything at all that Michael said about the responsibilities of sovereignty, it's also important to recognize that sovereignty has limits, and that the way in which the larger world in which Israel as a sovereign state participates and must participate uses universal human rights as the moral vocabulary in which it conducts these conversations. Now, I'd like to say that that is true in war as well as in peace. The basic laws of war post-World War II, the Geneva Conventions, the only universal treaty, that is the only treaty that every state in the world has signed on to ever since the last holdout signed a couple of years ago. This was the island Republic of Vanuatu, which had never joined the Geneva Conventions because it had no army, no military, but is now a party, are based on the idea that there are certain ways in which people who aren't combatants can't be treated, and those include humiliation, degradation, and torture, as well as the more obvious acts of physical violence. I should point out that the notion of human dignity has been incorporated in one of the most important documents, and that is the IDF's Code of Ethics, which several people in the audience here were involved in writing. I am currently participating in a project of the US Army, which is trying to draft its own Code of Ethics, and the IDF Code was one of the most important models that was offered to those who were participating in this project. I should also say that it is a very, very tough sell for the United States Army, which doesn't understand, perhaps rightly, how human rights and human dignity are compatible with killing people and breaking things. Nevertheless, this is one of the ways in which it seems to me that the discussions within Israel have actually made Israel a beacon for the world. Just to take up Michael's invitation to try to discuss issues of just war, I would like to point to a recent debate that Michael Walzer and Avishai Margalit have been involved in against Aza Kasher and Yadlin. And this is over the level of risk that soldiers must take in order to minimize civilian casualties. Walzer and Margalit have been defending the proposition that the level of risk is identical. It's very difficult to specify what that level of risk is, but it's identical regardless of whether the civilians whose casualties are being minimized are their civilians or our civilians. That's not the position that the opponents took. And I'd just like to say that the position that Walzer and Margalit took is the position that it seems to me represents cosmopolitan morality, and in that sense represents the one strain of the exilic mentality that I think that Israel is best not overcoming. So, thank you.
There's a famous Hebrew expression, Lama li l'tzara hazot. What do I need all these difficult issues? I remember when I came in Aliyah and students approached me and said, Rabbi Hartman, how could you support Israel and encourage Aliyah when this is a country that has helped create the arms industry in South Africa and has in some way strengthened the forces of apartheid? So how do you fit into this type of world? So in some way, I went to some people to say, help me understand. So that I was told, if you want an arms industry, if you want to produce armaments, you're going to have to be able to sell it to South Africa. So then I had to say to myself, what am I torn into? I've suddenly come to a reality in which the ugliest elements in the Jewish people show itself. So why am I such an ardent Zionist who encourages Aliyah? Maybe we ought to say, after listening to Michael, let's pack up. It was nice thinking, and Ben-Gurion could give a nice speech, but it has nothing to do with reality. Because if you go into the West Bank and you see how minorities are treated, or you go in Israel and see how Ashkenazim and Sephardim treat each other, and you say, what was it worth it? What price? And I know I paid a very deep personal price in the death of my son-in-law. Why? Why are we here? So, Michael, you talk about sovereignty. I mean, the issue is, maybe it was a mistake. Maybe the Golos was the best way to live. We weren't responsible for armaments. We didn't have to create armies. And we didn't have to have political leaders who are idiots. So in some way, it was a nice life to, Jews were portrayed as very nice. Woody Allen would have no problem with the Jews in the diaspora. Most people liked the Jews in the diaspora. They were always, so nice, so clean, so helpful. You went to every Federation building. It was beautiful. None of the schmutz was ever thrown outside. We kept our dirt separated from the rest, and everybody thought of the Jews as a moral, noble people, the carriers of the true moral principles. Mordechai Kaplan believed that. And, we were the chosen people, and we had the illusion of being a chosen people when we lived in the diaspora. Now you're going to say we didn't prepare ourselves for responsibility. Who cares? Who wants that responsibility? Maybe it was a mistake to have it. But what is the other part, Michael, which is not statehood only? Israel was created out of the memory of the Holocaust. And anyone who denies that is mistaken. Not out of some Baruchov or Berdichi or Acharaam. What created the gut feeling that we must have a state has been the Holocaust. And if you listen to, and I know my own son has told me, of all the speeches of the chiefs of staffs, the army people, when they go to Poland and to the March of the Living, the whole thing is, this will never happen again. We are now in a position to defend ourselves, and we're not going to be like cattle to slaughter. And that's a dominant thing that comes every time they go to Auschwitz. And why do they want to go to Auschwitz? It sort of tells them, you see, we need Jerusalem because the alternative was Auschwitz. And if you want to prevent the Auschwitz, then you better have a state. So Michael, therefore moral theories and all that, when that is that gut sentiment, when the sentiment is the memory of total destruction, then you function in a different framework. So when you deal the question, do you send armaments to South Africa, you see before you the gas chambers of Auschwitz, and you say, okay, what is more important, to have an army that could defend against that possibility, or do I have to now enter into cosmopolitan morality? What's cosmopolitan morality? Who's interested in that stuff? I'm interested in one thing. Can I protect myself? Can I protect myself against the enemies of the Jews? And we live with the illusion that we can, that Israel is strong enough, and this is why we have atomic bombs and all that, to in some way guarantee, to tell the world you'll pay a very great price if you start up with the Jews. Prior to the Galut world was you didn't have to pay a price. Now you pay a price if you beat up a Jew. And I remember the story of an Israeli who went to Lubavitch neighborhood in Crown Heights with some other Jews, and they were attacked by Afro-Americans. So everybody ran, the story went. The only one who stayed there and was prepared to fight was the Israeli. Because being an Israeli meant you don't run anymore. You don't look for the exit of how to get away quickly. So in some way, I ask myself, so what does sovereignty mean for me? Sovereignty means to be exposed to all the weaknesses of halachic morality, and to expose what is lacking in the Jewish tradition. We've been in history always talking about other people's dirty kitchens. And we came back to discover that our kitchen is also dirty. And that we are not the most purest people in the world. That's a shock. We thought the Goyim were all Rishoyim. And we discover, meanness, ugliness, and bitterness even amidst our own so-called chosen people, in which we say every day at the prayers, Asher Bacha Banu Mikol Amim, God, you chose us among all the nations of the world. In the diaspora, we had the illusion of being a chosen people. Israel has broken that myth. Thank God. There's no Jewish genetic morality. You could eat grossiges gefilte fish and you'll still be a brute. There's no secret weapon or secret food or secret that will keep Jewish purity. The most ugliest features of human beings are on display in this country. That's what sovereignty means. I know my own kitchen is dirty and I better clean it up. And I can't live with the moral criticism of others. So in some way, Michael, I share everything you say because it's so clear and so brilliant. He's my Rebbe in political theory. But you left out one thing about Michael Walzer. He's a serious student of Talmud. Michael is a Talmud Chacham who invites scholars from the Machon to come specially to Princeton and study with him. Princeton doesn't understand who are these visiting scholars teaching him Talmud. Walzer, what are you learning Talmud for? What's going on here? You wrote Spheres of Justice. That's enough. But that's a feature. I mean, he is the influence of his mother in that small town of Jamestown is Poshet for eternity. I mean, he is a Jew in all his limbs, and he's a student of Torah. Now, he still believes that this place is going to be a moral place. You see the influence of the illusions that Torah teaching has on you. You have to stop learning, Michael, and come into reality. The country is an embarrassment to Jews. When you meet Arabs, you're embarrassed. When you visit West Bank towns, you're embarrassed that you see the plumbing. You're embarrassed at the level of their schools. You're embarrassed at the level of their medical care. And you walk around and say, this is a moral country? I don't know, what are we talking about? This is a chosen people, Ben Gurion, all the illusions of what they thought Jews were. The Zionists made one mistake. They stopped believing in God, but they continued believing in the chosen people. That's a very interesting phenomenon. They really still think we are a chosen people. And thank God for Israel, and that's the meaning of sovereignty for me, Michael. That we have to get our hands dirty and stop living with myths about the Jews and stop reading all the stories of the Bible of God's special love for Israel and the prophetic descriptions of Israel, and that the world will be judged by what Israel does, and that God needs the Jewish people in order to be in history. All those myths, all those stories we tell, it exploded for me. I have no ground to believe that Israel is going to create a renaissance of Judaism. And if you read all my works, A Heart of Many Rooms or Living Covenant, Israel was for me the carrier of a new covenantal Judaism, of a new renaissance of the Jewish people, of a new Torah. I really believed we were going to write a new Torah, and that reality was going to invade Judaism, and we're not going to live with the shtetl memories of the past and read Heschel's The Earth is the Lord's to really believe who we are, which is a lie. Nothing in the book is true, but it's beautiful. It's beautiful. We like to tell stories about ourselves. I love this country because it's making me mature as a Jew. I love this country because it's telling me, Hartman, you better shape up the halacha and make it a living law that is freed from all the immoralities that are there. That's what sovereignty means for me. It gave me the opportunity to make Judaism a part of a way of life that embraces everything. Hospitals, the aged, morality of war, all those things, suddenly they become Jewish issues. Sovereignty gave us a total way of life to bring the spirit of Torah. And we're failing totally. And we have to admit that. But does that mean that because we're failing, that we'll never succeed? As long as there's people like Michael Walzer around, and Sandy Levinson, and Mark, and the people of the Philosophy Conference, and those wonderful philosophers from Haifa, who give us living experience of how it means to live with Arabs. As long as there are people like that who come together, learn, study, argue, and still believe that something worthwhile will be created here. For me, Michael, that's sovereignty. To never give up on the ugliness of the Jewish people. You know, to get up in the morning and say, the Rebbeinu Shalom says, listen, I chose the Jewish people because they were the worst. And you should know, I needed a challenge after I created the world. I was bored. So I looked around and I say, who is the worst people in the history? So he looked and looked and looked until he found the Jews. He says, okay, Jews, v'nikdashti b'toch b'nei Yisrael, and I shall be sanctified in the midst of the children of Israel. I need you to sanctify me in history. It hasn't worked. But he's still trying. And if he's prepared to continue trying, I'm content to continue believing. Thank you.